All right, everyone, and welcome back. And today we are going to get into Module 13, which is Turfgrass Diseases. And so let's get into it. So, what are the main diseases that we see on turf? And obviously, because this is Tri-C and we're in Northeast Ohio, we're going to focus primarily on that aspect of things with the cool season grasses that we typically find around here. But, keep in mind that many of these diseases, you can also see on some of the warm season grass varieties as well. But because we're in Northeast Ohio, um, I'm going to focus on diseases that we're going to primarily see, and we're not going to necessarily cover every single disease that we could possibly have up here. I really wanted to try and hit on some of the main disease and fungal issues that we come across up here. So one of the first ones that we'll often see in the springtime is red thread. This is Laticeria fusiformis. And many of you guys might have seen this. Basically, as the name suggests, it is forms like this red um, thread-like structure, reproductive structure on the end of the blade of grass. And we primarily see this on perennial rise and fine fescue. So we're not going to normally see this, or we're not really going to see this on Kentucky bluegrass. We're not going to see it on turf type tall fescues. We're gonna see this primarily on ryegrass lawns, perennial ryegrass lawns, and we're going to see this in fine fescue lawns or cool season blends that would have perennial ryegrass and fine fescue. So we normally see this one in the springtime, but we can also see it again in the fall. Typically, we're going to see this in cooler, wetter weather where we have high relative humidity and the turf is green. It's actively, greening up, but it's not necessarily actively growing. So typically, this is a relatively weak disease. So when that turf is in that real active growth mode, it's pretty much going to outgrow this. Unless there's some other things going on. So, and some of the other things that might be going on would be, fertility issues. So, let's just say, for example, we have low nitrogen fertility. Maybe it hasn't been fed enough, or we didn't do maybe a winterizer application on it in the late fall of the previous year. So we're just not getting a good spring green up out of it, or if maybe we went too long between applications in the spring and it was losing some steam, that can, that can be one problem. So we definitely want to make sure that we're keeping nitrogen fertility up, because this is a relatively weak disease. So it's not something that I would say is a primary issue that we typically run into. It can get out of hand under certain circumstances, but typically, if you're starting to see it on a lawn, there's usually some other foul play going on that's causing it to be an issue. One of which, obviously, like I said, would be the nitrogen fertility. But another issue that we can sometimes see on lawns, especially Northeast Ohio, is, I've been seeing more and more of this where red thread is actually lingering into the summer. I've gone on properties where I've seen active red thread in July and even August. Now, this is not normal. I've also seen lawns that have this pretty widespread throughout the lawn, and damage can actually be quite extensive. And so when you're seeing widespread infection over an entire lawn or property, and you're seeing this linger on and continue to cause damage to the turf well into the summertime, this is probably a pretty good indicator that you're dealing with a phosphorus deficiency. And I actually I actually saw this years ago. I started seeing this where it was lingering on into the summertime. I actually reached out to Joe Rimmelsbach at Ohio State, one of my former educators faculty members when I was going through school as a pathologist, and I said, something's going on here, and he agreed. He said, this really isn't normal. So either we're seeing some more virulent strains of the Laticeria fusiformis, or something else has got to be going on. And that's when I said to him, do you think it could be a phosphorus deficiency? And he said, you might actually be onto something there. And so they did a little bit more work with it. And they actually did some trials down in the Columbus area where they found some pretty extensive red thread. And they actually found out that when they looked at a couple different, like I think they picked an entranceway at a Walmart or something like that, and they did some trials with a client down there, where one side got a fertilizer without phosphorus in it, and the other side got a fertilizer with phosphorus in it. Lo and behold, the side that ended up getting that little bit of phosphorus put down ended up clearing up and recovering, but the side that didn't continued to show signs of the disease. So, again, if we see this, it could be an indicator of, of a phosphorus deficiency. And, I don't remember if I'm going to hit this point later on or not, but I'll just say it here now that a lot of times when we run into diseases or insect issues, things like that, we do want to consider the fact that these could be a secondary symptom. Maybe they're not, obviously there's a problem there. There's a causal agent there causing the disease, but the disease in and of itself can sometimes be, and often can be, an indicator of other underlying issues that are causing the grass or the plant in general to fail to thrive. Sometimes, from a pathology standpoint, we see issues that really are exclusively the result of other, plant-related health, vigor issues, or environmental issues going on that are for whatever reason causing that plant to fail to thrive. And turf is certainly no exception. So, and getting back to the red thread, I mean, this is one that, it's a foliar disease. So it typically doesn't attack the crown or cause death. So, again, when we get back to that whole phosphorus issue, maybe there's something more to it. I mean, if you're seeing extensive damage and death, there's got to be more to it, because, again, this causal agent doesn't typically kill the grass. It usually clears up on its own, like I said. Sometimes we'll see this flare up again if we get a cool spell in the spring, for example, where, say in May, the grass kind of greened up and it was growing really well and greening up very nicely, but then we get a cold snap, like we got one going on right now. It's the, 21st of April, 22nd of April, 2021. We got actually 4 inches of snow last night and yesterday. So we had a cold snap here. Obviously, cold temperatures like that are going to slow down or stop that growth of the turf. And obviously, if it's overcast, cooler weather, and we got some moisture there to work with from the snow, there's a possibility in the next week or two we'll probably see some red thread cropping up. So again, once temperatures warm up and fertility kicks in, the grass starts growing again, it usually clears up on its own. But sometimes, what we'll see is we'll see this, red thread dollar spot complex where no sooner than the red thread starts clearing up, then we see this guy coming in. This is called dollar spot. Sclerotinia homeocarpa would be the causal agent on this one. And typically, we're going to see this in, it can affect pretty much all turf, primarily blues and ryes, though. So when we have these blue rye blended lawns, it's typically where we're going to see it. Also on creeping bent grass. But it can really affect any turf. Again, primarily, as far as we're concerned, it's going to be creeping bent grass, Kentucky blue, and perennial rye. So, again, like I mentioned a moment ago, sometimes I see what I would call a red thread dollar spot complex. We're seeing more and more of that, especially because of this phosphorus deficiency that's cropping up more and more. You may remember I mentioned in one of the previous sections, I think under the fertility discussion, that I had a client, large lawn care company that's a client of mine, tell me recently that 65% of all the soil tests he run are coming back phosphorus deficient. So, we're talking nearly 2/3 of lawns, and he's a pretty good cut, a pretty good sized client. He runs a lot of soil tests. So, when you look at the statistical side of it, just based on how many tests he's running in the area that he covers, I mean, you could start applying that to a bigger segment of the area and say that it's possible that we are seeing about 2/3 of the properties in Northeast Ohio coming back phosphorus deficient. So when does this one get going? Typically in the summertime when temperatures and humidity increase. So this is a warmer weather disease. It does prefer hot day temps when the lawn is dry, but the relative humidity is relatively high. And it likes when the nighttime temperatures are above 55 degrees. So, when we get into that 70 to 80 degree weather during the day and mid 50s at night, and it's relatively dry, usually, especially going from May into June, typically that May-June transition tends to be on the hot and dry side, but we still have, high relative humidity. This is when we're going to see this thing starting to flare up. One of the primary indicators that we're looking for with it is this hourglass-shaped lesion. Typically, you'll see it about mid-blade on your blues and your ryes. And again, also on bent grass, but really easy to see this on your blues and ryes because they have a bigger blade. But you'll see this hourglass-shaped lesion, as you see in this picture here, where it kind of shrinks in on the sides of the lesion, mid-blade, and then you see these darker bands, from the active infection region on either side of that necrotic lesion. So, on low cut bent grass, like on greens and tees, you're going to start seeing this thing typically develop as silver dollar spot or silver dollar sized spots. Got a little tongue tied there, sorry. Silver dollar sized, if you can imagine that, spots on low cut turf, like greens and tees on bent grass. So hence the name dollar spot. That's actually where they coined that name, was from that silver dollar sized patch. And on higher cut turf, like you would find in a lawn setting, you're typically going to see larger. This would be a good example in this picture here. You'll see this little bit larger, 2 to 3 inch diameter, more nondescript spot in a lawn, and these typically will start coalescing together to form larger. Think of like a Harlequin, Great Dane or Dalmatian thing, where you start getting all these spots kind of coalescing together, forming larger areas, just like you see here in the picture. So, again, almost like a Dalmatian spot. And sometimes if we get out there early in the morning before that sun's coming up, or just as it's coming up, and you got that heavy dew in the morning on the lawn, you can see this cottony mycelial growth actively infecting the turf. And again, it prefers warm days and cool nights with that heavy dew, that high relative humidity, especially at night. That's when you're going to see this in the morning. When you get that cooler evening and you get that high relative humidity, where that dew point and in the evening temperature kind of combine, you get that heavy dew on the grass. Another thing that can also promote this disease is frequent irrigation. Not heavy irrigation, but frequent, meaning if you're out there watering very frequently to where you're kind of promoting that humidity, that high relative humidity in the canopy, that can contribute to this. If we remember when we talked about irrigation best practices, deep and infrequent, that's one of the reasons that as a pathologist, I recommend that deep and infrequent watering is so that you can give that canopy a chance to dry out a little bit in between, and we're not promoting. Again, also, we don't want to be watering overnight because, as you can imagine, dollar spot, no different from many diseases, tend to be very active at night when the temperatures are cooler and they have that humidity to work with. So, like red thread, it can be a sign of low nitrogen. So, typically, if we have adequate to higher nitrogen inputs on turf, we see the frequency reduced. So, if you go onto a lawn midsummer or a turf area midsummer, it could be a diagnostic indicator of low nitrogen. Maybe it's gone too long in between, or we just weren't putting enough down, or maybe environmental factors depleted that nitrogen before we were able to get back there in time. But whatever the case may be, this can often be an indicator of inadequate nitrogen. And you can tell because you pretty much would see, more or less anemic growth, just like if we had a phosphorus deficiency. And I'm not gonna rule out the phosphorus on that either, because again, if you remember earlier on in this discussion, we talked about that red thread dollar spot complex. And so again, if we have low phosphorus, you put all the nitrogen you want. It's a red-green nutrient, and red light, green light nutrients. So if we don't have enough phosphorus, you can put all the nitrogen you want on that lawn, and it's probably not going to grow and recover. That's why I said again, if we have a low phosphorus situation, we can often see these two diseases going hand in hand with each other. So it can actually thin the turf out if left unchecked, where red thread tends to be relatively benign under normal circumstances. When this thing gets going, if it has a chance to get a foothold in the summertime, it can actually thin and damage the turf if left unchecked, at which point you are going to need to put a fungicide down to get it under control. So once this thing does get going, if you come on a property where it is pretty extensive, you're not going to be able to fertilize your way out of this disease. You are going to have to put a fungicide down. Another interesting thing, when I was in school at Ohio State, my advisor and one of my professors, Dr. Bain, was doing a lot of work at the time on the use of biosolids and organically based fertilizers. And he found that using organics and biosolids, things like that, tended to significantly reduce the risk of this disease. And he was doing it on a lot of sand-based putting greens and tees. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. I think what typically is going on, when we talk about organics, is that by feeding the turf and creating organic matter, it does a couple of things. One, it's going to promote other fungi and other beneficial microbes. It's going to promote those in the soil, and you're going to get crowding, you're going to get competition, and it doesn't allow these pathogens a chance to get a foothold, so to speak. So you're just basically tying up the real estate with a lot of other things, not allowing that pathogen a chance. The other thing to keep in mind, again, remember I told you that diseases especially a lot of times can be a secondary issue on a lawn. Many of these are what we would call saprophytic fungi. So, and that's a complicated term. Basically, what it means is that these things tend to be relatively benign. They're always there. They're always present in the soil. You're never going to get rid of them unless you put so many fungicides down that it, in essence, can sterilize the soil and make it devoid of microbial life. But that's very hard to do. So beyond that, you're always going to have these fungal pathogens present in the soil. But sometimes what can happen is something environmentally will flip a switch in them to where they tend to be, normal, harmless, beneficial microbes in the soil doing their thing, breaking down organic matter and being totally hunky dory. But sometimes something can happen environmentally to trigger a switch, flip that switch, and turn these things into a parasite that actually starts attacking the turf. And that's the difference. So, one of the theories I think behind the organics is that basically if you're providing them with an adequate enough food source, then they never really, flip that switch to where they end up attacking the turf. And so, a couple of different mechanisms going on there, but overall does seem to promote the idea of using organics and organic based fertilizers. And I will say that I have plenty of lawn care companies out there running, organically based programs. And we do definitely see a reduced incidence of things like dollar spot and red thread on those lawns. So another one that we see up here in the spring, especially mid-May, so we probably will see this coming up, rearing its ugly face in a couple weeks, is leaf spot. So there's a couple of different, actually there's several, I'll just say that. There's several different causal agents that we all kind of lump into the leaf spot bucket. They're just there's a lot of them. I'm not going to get on all of them here, but the couple that I'll focus on for this discussion are Drushlera poae and Bipolaris sorrel-kiniana. These are probably the two main ones that doesn't really matter which one it is. We're going to deal with them the same way. That's why they kind of get lumped into the leaf spot bucket. Two different causal agents basically cause the same problem, and we deal with them the same way. But just know that there's several, even beyond the Bipolaris and the Drushlera, there's several other causal agents that can get in here and get lumped into this category. Again, these are going to typically occur mid-spring. We're talking May timeframe, mid-May timeframe, and we can also see them crop up again in early fall, like in that September timeframe, if the conditions are right. They can also occur once they get going in the spring. It's not uncommon to see these things continue to occur and flare up throughout the summer, especially if we have one of these, what I call a Canadian summer, where it tends to be, we get these periods where we get cooler, more overcast conditions and wetter conditions where we have that lingering humidity in the turf, and the turf is still kind of in that cool season peak growth mode because of those cooler temperatures, where we're still getting that, continual lush green growth throughout the summer, and it never really hardens off. And so in this one, all turf grasses, all cool season grasses are susceptible. We primarily will see it on the bigger bladed grasses like bluegrass, perennial rye, but we can also see it on bentgrass and fine fescues. It typically occurs on the leaves in the spring and fall, but this thing can actually also attack stems and crown and roots. If it gets more aggressive, there seems to be some mechanisms that can cause it to switch over into this much more aggressive mode, which we call melting out, where you can actually see very, very large areas of turf dying out. So this would be an example of what we would often see in that May going into June time frame. Maybe if the temperatures kick up a notch and that humidity is still there, we can actually see it go into this melting out mode where you just see large patches of grass melting out. So if you're in a lawn and you're wondering if that's what you're dealing with, again, you're going to go to that margin between the dead or dying grass and the grass that's still healthy. You want to go right to that marginal area there, and you're going to get down and you're going to look at the grass and maybe pull some out where you find some lesions or spots on it. You're actually going to look for these dark purple or black lesions on the leaves that fade to tan, and oftentimes what I'll see, if you can see it here, is you'll see this very distinct yellow halo form around these lesions, and during the melting out, the turf is actually going to turn more of a yellow color. Versus like a tan or a brown, something like that. It's not going to get that straw color. It actually gets this very, as it's actually dying, not when it's already dead, but when you see these areas in decline, it actually gets this very kind of distinct, very like, call it almost like a mustard yellow color. Um, and the thin, the patches will thin out, so you'll see these areas thinning out pretty extensively, and the blades of grass often will appear soaked. Once it's run its course, you'll come in and you'll see these areas, these patches are often going to be like a darker brown color and matted. So again, even once it's done its job on the turf, again, they're going to look very different with this disease. More of a dark brown, matted appearance. While it's active, you'll see the grass thinning. You'll see the blades of grass kind of looking more water soaked, and it'll have kind of that, like I said, a distinct yellow cast to it as it's actively dying. So when you get into this melting out phase, one of the other things, again, like I said, it'll attack the crown, the stems, the roots. So the roots and the underground structures can also have this reddish brown, almost like a rotted appearance. And the melting out is going to occur whenever you have that hot, dry spell, typically followed by a heavy rain and a period of slightly cooler weather with high humidity. So was it this last summer, or maybe I think it was this last summer in 2020? I ran into this. So we had a really hot, dry period when we went from May into June, like 90-degree weather. It got really hot, really dry. We did have leaf spot present going into that period. Then everything just baked for about a week or two. But then we had this real heavy rain that came through, and the temperatures moderated a little bit on the backside. So, anytime we have that kind of a pattern set up where we have this hot, dry period, then a heavy rain, followed by some slightly cooler weather with that high humidity present, that's going to be a perfect scenario for leaf spot to go into melting out, especially if we already had it present in that May to June time frame. So another thing that's interesting about this disease is broadleaf herbicides and DMI type fungicides like propiconazole can actually worsen the disease or cause a flare up. And this is a good point to mention, because a lot of times when we're in this May and June time frame, especially in a lawn care business, a lot of companies may be out what we would call blanket applying broadleaf herbicides on lawns. And if they happen to do some fungicide treatments, maybe somebody wanted them to come out because they had some red thread or some dollar spot on that lawn. Again, keep in mind that when the conditions are right, if you go out and use a DMI type fungicide, propiconazole being a very common one, also known as Banner Max, only because it's so cheap. So for lawn care, cheaper is better usually, and it's about as cheap as you're going to get on a fungicide. So commonly used in lawn care for people that want fungicide applications. Just keep in mind, if the conditions are right, it actually can spawn a flare up of this disease, and that's because herbicides, especially your phenoxy-based broadleaf herbicides, they're a growth regulator. Remember, they work by mimicking growth hormones inside plants, and DMI fungicides also have a call it a plant growth regulator effect. Especially those DMIs, they can have a plant growth regulator effect where they actually will slow down or stunt that growth. And sometimes what can happen is it can prevent the turf from being able to defend itself, from an attack. And so that's kind of what's going on when we talk about these fungicides or these herbicide products potentially causing a flare up of this disease. The disease will stay dormant in thatch and dead plant material. This is a good indicator if you have a real thatchy lawn. That lawn, again, when we talk about doing dethatching or aerations and things like that, trying to get rid of that thatch layer or even verticutting for that matter, that's another benefit. Again, where, we can alleviate the potential of seeing this disease when we can manage that thatch properly. So, um, this is the next one we're going to get into, rust. This is another common one that we see on lawns. Going to mention it. It's typically not a big. It's typically not a problem that we're going to treat for. It's more of a cosmetic thing, but it is very prevalent in lawns in Northeast Ohio. Sometimes can be prevalent at different times of the year. There are many, many causal agents of rust on lawns, especially depending on if it's spring rust or fall rust. There's a couple different types of rust on lawns, and the main causal agent that we're going to talk about is Eurymyces dactylitis. So that would be, if you want to give it a name, a Latin name, that would be the one. But Eurymyces in general, again, there's several other causal agents, almost like leaf spots. There's several other causal agents that can contribute to rust. This is a foliar disease, so it is going to occur on the leaves. It doesn't occur really anywhere else. It can affect all turf grasses. I've seen it even on tall fescues, especially with some of these other causal agents. You can actually see it forming on tall fescues as well. It can affect all turf grasses, but mainly Kentucky bluegrass and perennial rye. A lot of the common lawns up in Northeast Ohio, blue rye lawns. That's why we see so many rust issues up here. So again, the turf looks like it's covered with orange rust. So that's why we call it rust. You see this, and if you were to walk through these areas, if you see a lawn, it's got rust. Sometimes you don't even see it in the lawn, okay, but you'll know that it's there because when you walk out of that lawn, you'll notice that your shoes are covered in this, yellow or orange dust, and that's all the spores from this. Another thing to keep in mind with it too is, again, it doesn't typically kill a lawn, but when we get a really, really heavy rust year, and it's a lawn that's particularly susceptible, maybe there's some other, again, secondary issues, or primary issues. I'll rephrase that. Primary issues going on in that lawn. The rust is more of a secondary issue, so it can be an indicator of other things going on in the lawn. But if we get a heavy enough infestation of this on a lawn, it can yellow the lawn out. Typically isn't going to kill it, but it can cause some yellow and some decline in the lawn, mainly because of the blades get so covered with rust spores that they can't photosynthesize. And so, you just start losing chlorophyll production. So typically we see it in late summer and early fall. Again, it can sometimes occur in a warm spring following a mild winter. I have seen carryover. There's also a couple of causal agents that will cause springtime rust that are different than the Eurymyces. So it's favored by warm, moist weather with prolonged leaf wetness. I think you can see that we have a pattern kind of developing here with humidity and moisture and leaf wetness. So, again, with all these diseases, moisture is a big, driving force behind a lot of these to get them going. Again, when we talk about other primary issues going on with lawn, it is favored by poor growth and low nitrogen fertility. So red thread, dollar spot, rust, again, can be promoted by low nitrogen fertility. So the first course, I should say action, sorry about that. The first course of action is usually to grow out with fertilizer for that reason. So usually, and you may have heard this from other landscapers or people in the know with turf care, that one of the common things that we're going to do is pound it with nitrogen and try and grow it out. In many cases, that often is enough to get it to recover. It is somewhat unavoidable. The life cycle of this thing is very, very complex. It has like 5 different life stages that it goes through, and each one of those has a different host plant, and different, it's a very, very, if you ever get bored and you want to look at it, it's a very interesting disease, just because of how complex and complicated it is. But that being said, because of that complexity with it, it is unavoidable. So if you get it, you're going to get it. You were going to get it. There's nothing that you can really do to stop it. It's just the way it is. There are some resistant turf varieties available. So that's something that you can look for with your Rise and Blues, especially to see if there's some rust resistance on those. A lot of the improved varieties are coming out with more disease resistance in general, including rust. So, keep that in mind, especially if you want to aerate to dethatch that lawn or help, remove some of the thatch in that lawn. You may want to sell them on an overseed with some improved varieties, especially if it's a lawn or turf area that's prone to seeing this over and over again. It's a good indicator. Maybe you just got some susceptible turf varieties there, and that's all that needs to be done is just mix up that profile a little bit in that lawn. So the next one that I'm going to hit on is gray leaf spot. This is caused by Pyricularia gracia. And this is a relatively newcomer to the landscape realm in Northeast Ohio. We haven't really had to deal with this in years past. It's not a new disease, but it is relatively new into Ohio, and especially in Northeast Ohio. It can be devastating, especially to older ryegrass lawns. Although it typically doesn't kill them, it just makes them look like junk. And it can also affect tall fescue, though it isn't usually severe. This is a good picture here, just showing the lesions on tall fescue. It'll also affect things like St. Augustine grass in the south. So, some of the warm season grasses are also affected pretty heavily by this one, and it can be pretty destructive on them as well. But tall fescue is pretty resistant, but you can see that, and this is a good indicator too. If you have ryegrass and you maybe have some areas of contamination where you have clumps of tall fescue going in there, don't be afraid to go look at that tall fescue. Because again, it probably, and I've seen this many times on lawns where you go look at it, and some of the tall fescue contamination in a turf area has these lesions on there, and it's pretty much a dead giveaway that whatever knocked out the ryegrass and smoked it, here you go, because it's not going to do in the tall fescue, but you'll find it there. It is worst on newly seeded and newly established lawns. It's typically less severe once that lawn's been in for several years and has had a chance to mature. So, again, I typically, if it's say a 5-year-old lawn or less, that's where I get concerned. Older lawns, again, it could be pretty bad, but those older lawns tend to recover to some degree once it's passed, and but the new lawns can be smoked, and they're dead and done, and it's not coming back. So in order for this one to get going, it needs at least a week of high temperatures. I mean hot, above 90 degrees every day, and high relative humidity. So, one thing that's interesting about this disease is it usually rides along, comes up on, from the south, and it rides along on hurricane remnants. So, if we ever get a hurricane or a tropical storm that comes in, say in the Gulf Coast there, down over Texas or Louisiana, and it moves its way up the Mississippi River and up over us. Obviously, we don't typically see a hurricane in Ohio, but what'll happen is you'll get that lingering tropical depression that's kind of slowly moving its way up and inland. And a lot of times we don't get any real rain or thunderstorms or anything like that off of it. But if you think about it, whenever one of these things ends up moving over top of us, I mean, it gets really like deep south hot and deep south humid. I mean, it's just like, oh, like oppressive. And when one of these things comes through, because I mean, it is just rough. If any of you've ever been down in the deep south in the summertime, I mean, it'll knock the wind out of you. It's just so oppressive. So those kind of conditions, when we get one of these kind of scenarios where it is just mugly and 90 degrees for at least a period of a week or so, that is going to really get this thing going. And usually what'll happen when I go on a lawn is, and I always start looking for this when the conditions are favorable for it, because once it gets going, it's quick. So in order to properly diagnose and assess, or even to evaluate whether or not this thing's going to be going, I go to a ryegrass lawn, I look, and I'll start seeing the lesions forming on the leaves as these tiny, gray to black, almost like a pinprick that grows into a round or oval shaped water-soaked lesion. And it's usually along the veins. If you see, they always kind of occur in line with the veins, or right here, like you'll see along the leaf margin. And you see this dark margin that forms around that lesion, that pinprick lesion. And under the right conditions, kind of like dollar spot and a couple of other diseases, under the right conditions, you can actually see gray mycelia growing all over the turf. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you'll see just wide, extensive areas where this disease is going to town, and you'll see that gray mycelial growth. So the lesion can a lot of times coalesce, and you'll see this where the blade dies back from the tip down toward the crown. And you see, like, those water-soaked lesions basically end up causing that blade to kind of shrivel up and curl up and twist up on itself, just like you're seeing in this picture. I kind of hit on this a moment ago. It's very, very rapid. So that's why I said, if the conditions look like they're going to be favorable, I try and get out and see if I can find it ahead of things, because it is very rapid. And I've seen situations where an entire lawn is blighted in just, maybe 2 or 3 days. It'll take out an entire lawn, and you'll see the turf just turns yellow, and then the blades become scorched and twisted like you saw in that picture. Right here where they start getting like twisted and curled up like that. And, a lot of times it can look like drought stress. And, it's difficult to prevent. So this isn't something where we're necessarily going to be able to put down like a preventative fungicide in time. Usually by the time it does come to your attention, the disease has already run its course. So by the time a customer calls, or by the time you come across it in the field, the damage has pretty much already been done. And you can one of the management strategies that I recommend to most people that I work with is to plant gray leaf spot resistant perennial ryegrasses, and also to avoid spring seedings with rye, because remember, this thing is particularly devastating on new seedlings and newly seeded lawns. So if you go out and you put a brand new lawn in May, because that demanding customer is just demanding that you get out there and do this, just be prepared that especially if you're using rye or a blend with rye in it, that you stand a pretty good chance of that rye getting smoked over the summer. And, that customer is going to be even more upset. Most years, it's not an issue in Ohio. Again, you think about our typical weather pattern here in Northeast Ohio, especially because we're moderated by Lake Erie. Most years, we don't really see this pest. It was active last year, and it was active a couple of years ago. but we don't typically see this pest in Northeast Ohio. Part of the reason I think it is becoming a bigger issue is, we talk about climate shift and climate change, and we've talked about how those USDA zone hardiness profiles have been changing over the last, couple of decades. So we've definitely overall we've seen a warming trend in Northeast Ohio. So, the more that we're on the warming side of things, the more often we're going to probably see this thing cropping up. So, another summertime disease that we will run into, especially mid to late summer, is powdery mildew. This one is Uriciphe graminis. It's a little bit of a tongue tire there. And, this one, again, mainly affects Kentucky bluegrass. We don't really see it on most other grasses. Typically, if it's a bluegrass lawn, bluegrass sodded lawn, this is where we're going to see this one. And it usually occurs under shady conditions where we have poor airflow and high humidity. So like my old house that I used to live at, I had a big linden tree out front. It was very shaded. There was a lot of Kentucky bluegrass kind of growing in and around underneath that tree. And quite often, especially if it was very humid out, I'd see this powdery mildew forming on the Kentucky bluegrass in my lawn. So it doesn't attack the turf, but in heavy infestations, it can cause yellowing and thinning of the turf due to that shading effect, just like with rust. Typically isn't killing the turf. It's just more because it's blocking the sunlight from getting through into the leaf and blocking photosynthesis. You can start to see some yellowing and thinning of the turf. It is very, very easily controlled by a fungicide. So if you do end up with a lawn that has it really, really bad, don't worry, because it is very easily controlled by fungicide. Other than that, it's more of a cosmetic thing. And typically isn't what we would call a pathogen on a lawn. Another one that would fit into that category that we will also kind of see under similar conditions to powdery mildew is slime mold. So there's a couple different causal agents. Usually it's a mucilaga or a fusarium that'll cause this guy, and the slime molds are very interesting. Again, they're not a pathogen. They're basically using the turf as a structure to reproduce on, similar to powdery mildew. But they're very, very distinct when you come across them, and that's how you know, or how you can tell the difference between a slime mold and a powdery mildew, is they have this very, very distinct dark blue-gray color. And again, typically when we see them is late spring and late fall, where we have this prolonged leaf wetness. So we can see it sometimes over the summer if we have a period of time where we have that cooler weather pattern where we have prolonged wetness, or maybe a lot of rainy overcast days in a row. But not uncommon to see this both in late fall or late spring. And again, doesn't usually attack or parasitize this turf. And it's usually resolved by mowing. And, that's enough that once the grass is actively growing and conditions dry out, usually that's enough to, get this thing under control. There's my daughter in the background. Say hi, Haley. Hi. All right. So next on the list is anthracnose. This one is Colotrichium cereale. And don't normally see this one on your blues and rye and other cool season grasses that we see in a lawn setting. This is a big problem on Poa annua, which is your annual bluegrass, and older varieties of creeping bentgrass. So things like Pencross. Pencross is an old bentgrass variety. So, we're typically talking about older bentgrass varieties that have been around for a long time, or Poa annua. So big problem on golf courses, but If you have a lawn that has a lot of bentgrass contamination in it, or Poa annua contamination in it, this can be an issue in a lawn setting as well. So one of the good indicators that I'll run into with this is it has this very characteristic black sporing body. These are called acervali, and they are visible on the affected turf. And you can really actually almost see them with the naked eye. It is a little more helpful to see them with a hand lens. This is obviously under a microscope, but these acervali will be on the leaves and the stems and the crowns and the stolons on bentgrass, or the leaves, stems, and crowns on Poa annua. And this, like I said, you can almost see, when you look at it under a hand lens, you're not going to see these individual little acervali necessarily, but you will see this blackish. You can almost kind of make them out here, but that's basically what you're going to see when you're looking at the plant. Again, this is another infection where, or another picture showing the active infection where it's caused what we would call basal rot. So when we get this anthracnose basal rot where it moves down again into the stems and the crown, it'll actually kill off patches of the turf. And that's, if you may have heard this before, especially if you had a golf course experience, it's called anthracnose basal rot. So the turf usually will have, and this is bentgrass again, so bentgrass, greens, tees, things like that, you're going to see this coppery appearance. The blades will usually have like a yellow-orange lesion on them. Again, it can be an issue on lawns that have bent and POA contamination in them. So you can see, this is a good example here where we get into this color region around the green where you're going to have, other cool season grasses growing, but you can very clearly and distinctly pick out the bentgrass contamination because it's clearly been infected by it, has that coppery appearance, and more than likely went into that basal rot situation just because it's usually higher cut bentgrass and just has more surface area exposed to be negatively affected by that disease. So next on the list, this is another summertime disease like anthracnose. Causal agent is Rhizoctonia solani, and real common disease in the summertime around here. Can be found on any turfgrass species. It is most common in tall fescue lawns, but we can also see it in perennial ryegrass lawns or creeping bentgrass. But the primary host is going to be tall fescues, especially your turf-type tall fescues. It is a foliar disease. It has these irregular shaped tan lesions on the blade with a darker border. So if you remember the dollar spot, couple things between this and dollar spot's got that hourglass shaped lesion with the kind of those straight bands over, on either end of the margins on either end of that lesion. Again, dark brown band on that margin area, but straight lines on, and it's not going to be on tall fescue. Tall fescue, you're going to see these irregular shaped lesions, just like you're seeing in this picture with the dark banding. But again, it's going to be on tall fescue. So typically, you're not going to see this on blue, and it's on ryegrass, but typically to a lesser extent. So interesting thing about this one is it doesn't actually kill the turf. This is on bentgrass again here on a green situation. So just showing that you can get it on bentgrass, but you'll see these patches forming, as the name suggests, brown patch. So you see these brown patches of grass forming. It typically is going to start off as a 6-inch diameter spot. So a little bit bigger spot than you're going to see with a dollar spot infection on high cut turf. And you'll see these spots coalescing into larger 2 to 3 foot yellow or brown patches. in a lawn situation. And these patches can often have a frog eye appearance where the center begins to green up. The patches typically have a dark brown or purple margin, especially when this disease is active. And it occurs during hot, dry periods with higher humidity. So anytime that we don't have a lot of rainfall and we have, call it drought-like conditions, where it's very hot during the day, 85, 90 plus degrees, with a high relative humidity. So otherwise dry, but high humidity in the air, and kind of droughty conditions in the turf. That's typically when we're going to see this disease getting going. And it often occurs in heavier soils, so like your clay or silty clay type soils, silt soils that are compacted and have poor drainage. So, one of the management tools that I'll recommend to people is that if they have a lawn or an area that gets affected by this, to go in and schedule this thing to get aerated in the fall, because aeration and improving that airflow and relieving that compaction is really going to help prevent this disease. So this is one like dollar spot and like gray leaf spot that we can see cottony mycelia, especially if we have a heavy evening downpour where you have that lingering wetness and humidity overnight. I've seen situations in like the Solon area, for example, in Aurora, where, I remember a few years ago, a client sent me some pictures. I haven't been able to find them to put them on the slide presentation, but anyways, customer sent me pictures, and I swear to God, it looked like it had snowed in the picture. Literally, the entire lawn and entire subdivisions were just covered with what looked like snow. And it's exactly what happened. I remember we had a really heavy downpour. Thunderstorms moved through the night before, like 6, 7 o'clock, just heavy, like tropical downpour type rain. And then the temperature dropped that evening a little bit, and it just lingered all night long. And the next morning, that's what people woke up to. So just a real interesting one. We don't a lot of times see the mycelial growth, but just keep that in mind. Sometimes early in the morning before the sun comes up and burns the dew off, or if we get one of these heavy wet downpours late at night, sometimes overnight or the following morning, we'll see that cottony mycelial growth. Another one that we run into in Northeast Ohio is summer patch. The causal agent on this one is Magnaportha poae. And this one, unlike brown patch, which primarily affects tall fescue, this guy affects Kentucky bluegrass and poa annua. And it's especially bad on sodded lawns, so versus seeded. So we don't typically see this one as much on a seeded situation, but if it's a sodded lawn, a lot of times this disease being present is going to be a dead giveaway that it was a sodded lawn. So it's in the soil and it attacks the crowns and roots. So unlike most of these other diseases have always started out on the foliage, and then they maybe move their way down into the stems and the crowns and the root system. But they almost all start off, or they all started off as a foliar causal agent up to this point. This one actually isn't. This one is only in the soil. It stays in the soil. You're never going to see it. You're not going to know it's there. You're just going to see the damage and destruction caused by it, because this one actually attacks the crowns and roots exclusively. And what'll happen is, for some unknown reason, you'll go out and you'll see areas of the turf. Again, this is Kentucky bluegrass, often sodded situations. You'll see areas in these lawns that just turn yellow and die in 4 to 6 inch patches. And they grow into larger patches similar to dollar spot. If you go in and exhume some of the dead turfgrass carcasses out of this area, you'll see that they have a dark brown to black appearance. And the soil one of the other things that's real interesting about this disease is the soil ends up having this like particularly musty or earthy smell. If any of you work with soil to any degree, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, you just have to take my word for it. But some of you may know what I'm talking about when you think about this musty, very earthy smell. And the other thing that's really interesting too when you pull these things out, and this is a good picture here, is that the grass, when you pull out the dead plants, I mean, it's a relatively non-existent root system. You'll see there's like barely any roots, which most of these situations, if you've pulled healthy grafts out of the ground or whatever, I mean, you'll see this very thick fibrous root system. Not the case when this thing goes. You'll see maybe a few straggler roots coming off of this thing, but otherwise not exist. It's almost like you see this like stump formation here with maybe a couple of roots coming off, and it's got, like I said, that dark brown to black appearance. And then you can see how these plants are basically dying because they have no root system, and the crown is basically also killed at this point. So it's a goner. Plant's not going to live. The active infection occurs at the margin of the patch. And the interesting thing is that when you see this thing, if it's been in that lawn for any length of time, you'll see that the Kentucky bluegrass tends to regrow into that patch. Now, that's not because this grass that's dead here, like Lazarus, came back to life. That's not what's going on. What is actually happening here is this grass died, and then what happens is the surrounding healthy turf ends up repopulating that area, sending those rhizomes back into the center of that patch, which end up start forming a new plant that basically starts, tillering out and filling in that void. So this one is going to come back every year, and over time, what you'll see, if this has been going on for several years on a lawn, you'll see these areas that look like arcs or ripples or waves of dead grass throughout the lawn. Sometimes you can even see these rings forming, or like I said, an arc forming, in different areas of the lawn, and it just seems to kind of move. These things seem to move across the lawn, kind of like a fairy ring, but a fairy ring stays in place. I mean, these things literally, again, it's almost like it's marching or moving across the lawn very, very slowly. You're not going to be standing there watching this happen, obviously, but if you keep going back to that lawn, especially if it's an area that you mow weekly, you'll just see how this thing kind of lingers and progresses through the lawn. Fungicides can't help, or can help, I'm sorry, but they need to be soil applied. So we're usually talking about some heavy duty fungicides, and then we have to kind of soak them in with a wetting agent or some sort of penetrant to help get that down in. We're usually using a fair amount of water volume to get them moving. There are resistant Kentucky bluegrass varieties, so a lot of the newer and improved varieties of Kentucky bluegrass do have resistance. The one bluegrass that seems to show the most resistance to this disease is HGT, Kentucky bluegrass, which is a Barenbrug variety, and that one has exceptional summer patch resistance. Again, like some of the other diseases, this one is promoted by low nitrogen. So if there is a nitrogen deficiency on a property, you are going to increase the risk that this disease is going to get going. Again, especially if it's a sodded situation. So we definitely don't want to go too long between apps or too light on the nitrogen, depending on the growing conditions. Especially if we have one of these cooler summers where we have a very active growth period through the summertime. And we end up depleting the soil of nitrogen because the grass is just actively growing all summer long. That can cause this disease to flare up. And then when we have periods of heat and drought stress intermittently through the summer, that seems to really promote this thing and get it going. The next one that we run into, this is kind of an interesting one. I first saw it probably about 10 years ago up here. And it's funny because once I started finding this and making people aware of it, this disease has kind of become the catch-all disease. I mean, it's literally anything that could possibly be going on in a lawn where you see this kind of damage occurring. It's like it's the landscaper's choice lump sum disease that it must be ascochyta blight. Okay. Oh, you have ascochyta blight. That's what I'm trying to get to here. It's like that catch-all problem that, if anybody shows up on a lawn and they don't know what it is, it's like, oh, we're going to call it ascochyta blight. Okay. That's just how much of an issue it's become up here. And it is a very, very interesting one. It only occurs under very, very specific conditions. But the reason it's such a big problem up here in Northeast Ohio is because these very specific climatic conditions that promote this disease occur very regularly and actually very frequently, intermittently throughout the growing season in our area. So ascochyta blight, causal agent is Ascochyta species. There's multiple species, again, that contribute to this disease. So we just kind of lump them all into the Ascochyta bucket. And this one, again, it exclusively affects Kentucky bluegrass. And one of the hallmarks of it is it will leave any and all other grass, call it a species or a contaminants in that lawn, it will leave every other one in there unaffected. If you have a 100% Kentucky bluegrass lawn, sodded lawn, you're done. Okay, you're not gonna see this happen. But if it's a cool season mix, it's funny because you will actually see or begin to understand when we do these blended lawns where it's a cool season mix, you'll see, okay, well, here's the areas where the bluegrass was, and here's the areas where the rye and the fine fescue and the other stuff kind of took over, because it is going to single out Kentucky bluegrass in a lawn. So what are these interesting climatic factors that contribute to it? So it occurs when we have a period of cool, wet weather immediately followed by a period of hot, dry weather. Usually, and that should say May. Matt, I'm just not good at catching these typos. So, anyways, it's usually that May to June timeframe where we have that May to June transition. Almost every year in Northeast Ohio, we can count on going from a period of cool, wet weather in May into a period of hot, dry weather in June. And because of the lake and because, we're kind of close to Canada, we get this kind of back and forth all summer long where it's hot and dry, cool and wet, hot and dry, cool and wet. And so anytime we go from a period of cool, wet weather to hot, dry weather, this can happen, okay? And we can see it happen more than once throughout the growing season up here. And last year is a good example. We were kind of cool and dry in May and went into hot and dry in June. So I didn't see this thing in June, but when I saw it, it was like July going into August. They start going around. We had a little bit of a cool spell midsummer after we had a period of really warm, humid, wet weather, and then we had about a week or so where we had some cooler, drier weather, Canadian weather, Canadian southern summer pattern, and actually had a period where it was cool and wet, and then we went back into a period of hotter, drier weather again, and right then, mid to late summer, bam, this thing's going all over the place. So it's not just a May to June problem. It can occur anytime throughout the summer. And the disease is very fast, like lightning fast. It can affect large areas of turf in a day or two. And the turf will have this very light straw-colored appearance. So it's not a dark brown, it's not a yellow, it's not a tan. It's a very light straw-colored appearance, almost like if you sprayed it with Roundup. or even possibly like just scorched it, like with a flamethrower or something like that. Very, very similar appearance. Just that very, very light straw colored look to it. Again, this is another good picture. See how that grass has that very straw colored appearance. And you know, this is another hallmark of this disease is it's a foliar disease, but it's very good at tracking. And so tracking implies that it hitchhikes along on anything that's going through the grass. So feet, wheels, anything like that that's moving across the turf, it will actually track. It'll stick to that and it'll track and spread very easily, very quickly throughout a lawn. So you'll actually interestingly see this thing. And I've gotten into arguments with people, even doctors, even physicians, where they're like, you know, nature doesn't occur in straight lines. It's like, well, actually it can when it's aided by mankind. And this is an example where you can see where they drove through, you know, back and forth, and this is where the wheels went through, and it stuck to the wheels, and then as it was going back and forth across, it just spread all over. But even footprints, I've even seen this where footprints, you know, you'll have footprints through a lawn, and basically the dead leaves and thatch are covered with these tiny blackish, brownish spots called pycnidia. And those would be the fruiting sporing bodies on it. And, you know, again, when you get in there, if you have a hand lens, you might actually see a lot of these little spots. It's going to look different than, say, anthracnose. And also, again, keep in mind, because this is on bluegrass versus bentgrass or poa annua, is actually on Kentucky bluegrass. So if you know it's Kentucky bluegrass and you see this going on, you see a little, you know, blackish, brownish, you know, spots all over the leaves and stems and everything, that's ascochyta more than likely. It only affects the foliage. And the interesting thing is, even though this thing can look really devastating and wipe out huge swaths of grass, the turf usually recovers completely without a trace within a few weeks. You never even know it happened. And so in a lot of cases, this is one where I'll tell people, look, don't worry if you get it. Just, you know, feed the grass, water it, do what you need to just kind of promote that regrowth. And in 3 weeks, it'll be fine. So it's not something we can really treat for a fungicide. It's not something that we really need to treat with a fungicide. We just need to let it kind of grow out and recover from it, and it'll be fine. So it comes in quick, and before you know it, it's better. Another disease that can spread like wildfire through a lawn, and unfortunately, when it gets going, does not recover, is Pythium blight. So this one, again, is caused by Pythium species, and it's an oomycete. So oomycete means it's a waterborne fungus. Waterborne means that it absolutely needs moisture and lots of moisture in order to infect turf. It can attack any turf species. It's not just rye or blue or bentgrass. It will attack anything. It will kill anything and everything. Remember, ascochyta will single out bluegrass in a cool season lawn. This thing will kill everything there, okay? And it's going to attack everything there. It needs warm, humid weather where the nighttime temperatures are above 70 degrees. So we're typically talking about midsummer in that July time frame. Might see it in August if it's late July, early August. But typically it's going to be right in the peak of summertime when we're going to get the warmest evening temperatures above 70 degrees. And you need the turf, that should say turf, another typo. You need the turf to be damp for at least 12 hours. So this would be one of those where if it's midsummer time, you are not going to want to be watering and leaving that turf to sit damp overnight, or you could wake up in the morning and find out that this disease has started going on your lawn. So heavy dew and irrigation overnight, or even nighttime rainfall. Even though that's a natural event that we don't have any control over, that nighttime rainfall overnight can actually cause this disease. The blades of grass on initial infection are going to have this purple purpley gray, water soaked appearance. Just a very, you can see how the turf almost turns kind of this grayish green, like sickly looking, boogery green kind of color. I mean, it's not pretty. And you can see this cottony mycelial growth in the morning before the sun comes up. So very, very common to see this mycelial growth on Pythium. But remember, just because you see the mycelium in areas on a lawn, it does not mean that that it is you know Pythium. It could be brown patch, could be gray leaf spot, could be dollar spot. More than likely, it's dollar spot. It's usually the most likely one when I see the mycelium, especially if it's just in small spots or patches all over the lawn. You don't see the mycelial growth with gray leaf spot or brown patches often. And a lot of times we aren't going to see it unless the conditions are just right and we get up early enough in the morning. We're probably not going to see it here on these lawns. So large areas of turf can look smoky and gray like an oil spill on the grass during infection. So that's when you look at a lawn from afar, a lot of times you'll see like these large areas or patches where it just looks like you had an oil leak, like something blew up and you just got oil sprayed all over the lawn. It has that kind of darkish, gray, black appearance like you're seeing right here. The turf very quickly turns yellow, straw color, kind of similar to Ascochyta, but again, one of the differences here with this yellow straw color is that the grass actually, because it is this water-soaked lesion, the grass, it basically destroys the cell wall structure in the plant. So the grass ends up shriveling up and matting down. The dead blades look withered, shriveled, and twisted, kind of like gray leaf spot does, but much more extensively. Ascochyta, if you see Ascochyta, the grass is still standing straight up, so it doesn't destroy the structural integrity of the plant. It just kills it just kills the foliage, and that's what you're seeing. But Pythium, on the other hand, it does get in there and just structurally mess that plant up to where it mats down, shrivels up, looks distorted. So a very, very good indicator, and it's going to occur in large patches. This one actually can be promoted by too much nitrogen fertility, where you're promoting that lush, succulent growth. Doesn't typically occur on grass that's kind of hardened off from the hot, dry, periods over summer. So, if it's pampered grass where it's getting a lot of irrigation and a lot of fertility, and you got that lush, succulent growth, you could be inviting this disease to come in here and take it out. One of the things that really gets this thing going, and talked about this, in one of the other discussions, but guttation. So there's this byproduct of the plant called guttation, which is nutrient rich. It actually comes from structures on the plant. All plants have these. They're called hydrothodes. So trees and shrubs and flowers and every plant has hydrothodes. So the purpose of the hydrothode is it allows them to release excess turgor pressure inside of the plant. Otherwise, if you can imagine, it's like a balloon, right? If you keep blowing that balloon up, eventually it's going to pop, right? And plant cells are no different. Eventually, if they keep swelling up, they're going to pop and rupture and die. And so they have to have ways of relieving all of that hydrostatic pressure inside of the plant, because it can't really stop it. That water naturally is going to keep moving up and into the plant. And if the plant doesn't have any way to release it, the plant is going to die. It's going to swell up and die. So to counter that, plants have these things called hydrothodes, which are specialized pores that allow it to relieve that pressure. But as you can imagine, that material inside the plant, basically sap, if you will, is very nutrient rich. It's got a lot of carbohydrates and also all the nutrients that that plant's pulling out of the soil in it. Um, and uh, and what happens is a lot of times, especially in the morning, you'll go out and you'll see the dew, this heavy dew on the turf. Well, that dew isn't necessarily dew like atmospheric dew, where water from the atmosphere condense. Rather, it's this guttation, and this will occur in the summertime when the soil is warmer than the air and you have high relative humidity. So you're not, you got warm soil temps, cool air temps, humidity is high, so you don't get a lot of evaporation. So you end up with this buildup of fluid and pressure inside the plant. The stomates can't purge it because again, a high relative humidity is you know is preventing the water inside the plant from being able to off gas through the stomates. So the plant counters that by again having these pores called hydrothodes that allow it to relieve that pressure. On a grass plant, the hydrothode is actually where you would imagine it's actually at the tip of the blade. And so what'll happen is, you get these beads forming on the blade tip, and that's actually the guttation water on the tip of the blade. But where is all this going? Well, again, this is a nutrient-rich fluid coming out of the plant. This is going to feed insects and it's going to feed diseases. So one of the management practices that we'll use on turf, especially like athletic fields and golf courses and things like that, is but you can also do this in a lawn setting, is in the morning basically you get out there, or even midday if you need to, you can get out there and syringe the turf with irrigation just for a few minutes, not enough to really amp up that humidity, but just enough to knock that and dilute that out, to kick that off. Another practice that we commonly use on a golf course especially is something called dragging. And you can see this sometimes in the morning. You'll see them running around with golf carts out on the golf course with these big things dragging behind, and that's what they're doing. They're dragging the golf to knock this guttation off of the turf to prevent diseases. So now we're going to get back to the Pythium again. We're going to switch gears. We talked about guttation. Guttation, again, creating high humidity. Conditions are right. The air temperatures are cooler than the soil. That guttation fluid can really get, not just Pythium, but any diseases for that matter going. But another thing with Pythium along the same lines is we do not want to water at night. Again, that increases that prolonged wetness overnight, and watering at night can actually promote guttation. Especially if you think about the fact that it is going to be cooling that air around that turf plant, but the ground has got thermal mass. It's going to still be relatively warm, and you just gave it a whole bunch of water, and that water is going to end up going somewhere, and it's going to be going into the plant. So we can actually promote excessive guttation by watering at night. So one thing with Pythium is it is treatable. But we have to use special fungicides for Pythium. These are a couple here. Subdue Max, which the active ingredient on it is called methanoxam, and Segway, which is a newer one. These are two products that can help us control Pythium. Another thing that we can see with Pythium is something called damping off. Pythium and Phytophthora both can cause this to occur. What basically happens is damping off. If you've ever worked in the grower segment or whatever, you may have run across this term when you're growing out cuttings or from seed. There's this, or even in agriculture for that matter, there's a term called damping off. Basically, what happens is that newly emerged seedling, where it's very tender and very vulnerable, ends up getting attacked by either Pythium or Phytophthora. Now, a lot of times what'll happen is it's not necessarily enough to where, like, say, Pythium is going to cause Pythium foliar blight. The conditions are probably not going to be favorable to cause that Pythium foliar blight, but the same causal agent that can cause that foliar blight can also cause something called damping off, and it doesn't take very much. It doesn't have to have ideal conditions for this to occur. Typically, again, warmer weather. This is a real problem with spring seedings, these May, June seedings. And this is a good example of where basically damping off occurred and it ended up wiping out what otherwise was a brand new flourishing lawn. But particularly bad new seedlings. One of the ways that we prevent this is either by applying a Pythium fungicide at the time of seeding, or using seed that's coated with a fungicide to prevent damping off. Usually the active on that is called Apron. Pillar Granular is a really good product that I'll often recommend if we're worried about damping off. They can put this down as a granular application at the time of seeding to help give that turf some protection, and it actually helps promote health and vigor in the seedlings and faster growth and establishment as well. So there's some additional plant health benefits that we can pick up off of that pillar, besides just protecting us from damping off. And then Apron, again, would be usually used in that coating technology if we use coated seed. Main reason why I often will recommend coated seed for those spring seedings. So you think I asked some of you guys early on in class, just because the weather was perfect for it. I said, go out and see if you guys can scout around and find some snow mold. And I also did a little discussion that's also on the YouTube channel talking about the snow molds. I did that for a lot of my customers, but some of you may have watched that as well. The snow mold, again, winter disease or late fall through early spring disease. We're really dealing primarily with two kinds up here in Northeast Ohio. Mainly, we're dealing with the pink snow mold. This one is caused by Microdocium nivale. The other one that we do see, we actually saw this one this year. That's why I had the extra credit assignment to go find it, because it was here. This one is caused by Tifula. So there's a couple different Tifula species that can cause this. And so there's a subtype of gray snow mold called speckled snow mold caused by Tifula cariensis. And but there's again, typically your Tifula species are what's causing the gray snow mold. Pink snow mold, also known as pink patch or Microdocium patch, can be caused by snow, but it can also occur in cold, drizzly, overcast weather. And, contrary to the name snow mold, it does not actually need snow present in order to form. Cooler, wetter weather, 45 to 55 degrees with, kind of a dewy rain, like we get some of these lake effect, drizzly rain sometimes coming off Lake Erie, can promote this. And a lot of times I'll see this disease flare up in the springtime under those circumstances. Gray snow mold's a little different. This one's actually going to occur in much colder weather, and it also needs continuous snow and ice cover in order to affect the lawn. Wider bladed turf like tall fescue is more prone to getting it, but again, also Kentucky bluegrass and perennial rye, they do have a little bit wider blade and can also be equally effective, but usually tall fescue is the one that's most likely to show signs of this disease. Both of them are generally cosmetic, so they don't typically harm the rest of the plant, the crown and the roots and everything. They're pretty much just affecting the foliage. And usually the turf will grow out on its own in the spring. Gray snow mold is a little bit different, though. It can actually get bad enough to where it's attacking the crown and roots, killing off the turf. But we don't normally have cold enough winters with long enough snow cover to see this gray snow mold happen. Think about a polar vortex winter. We actually, like I said, here winter of 2020, 2021, towards the latter part of winter going through February, we actually did have slightly below average, like consistently below average winter temperatures where we were in like the 20s and sometimes even the teens. But we did have prolonged snow cover for a good solid month, and that's exactly the kind of conditions that you need for this guy to get going. And if you find snow mold damage, you don't want to rake it. That's one of the I don't know what it is about the snow mold and the raking. I guess people think maybe if I get out here and and okay, if you want to get out there and fluff it up a little bit, very lightly, with your hands, even just to kind of open that up and allow that to breathe and dry out, I'll give you that. But when we get in here and we start really raking at these patches, we're actually damaging the crowns, and if you damage the crown enough, you're going to kill the turf. So raking is a really good way to make sure that this grass never ever comes back from snow mold. So again, it's not deadly, but I think a lot of people think it is, because what happens is they get impatient, they go out and they start raking that grass, and then they do end up killing it, and now you do have to do something about it. It's kind of hard to prevent this disease with fungicides. We don't have a lot of great options, especially in call it the residential commercial lawn care market. There really aren't good options for preventing it. And even if there were, most clients are not going to be willing to pay to put those products down. You've really got to be a special kind of person as a homeowner, or property manager to want to invest that kind of money in it, because these products typically aren't cheap, and the rates that we have to apply them at to get any kind of efficacy makes them even more expensive. So one of the things that we can do, though, is we can avoid over fertilizing on that winterizer application in the late fall. Excessive nitrogen does promote growth, especially if we get some of those periodic warm-ups midwinter. You can actually get a flush of growth. If there's enough residual nitrogen there, you'll actually promote a little bit of growth if we get into these warm periods, and that'll increase the risk. So typically, when we talk about winterizer applications, a half a pound to 3/4 of a pound of nitrogen is more than sufficient. Keep in mind that typically in the off season, the grass isn't really actively growing. It's not producing new tissue and tillering and growing rhizomes and stolons. But what it is doing is it is still actively photosynthesizing. And so any fertilizer that you're putting on there is going to be taking that and building up amino acids and building up carbohydrate reserves underground. I did misspeak on that. Your roots are typically growing, and underground structures are typically growing, because in the fall especially, we do have warmer soil temperatures. So cold air temperatures, so you're not getting a lot of top growth on a lawn at that time, but we are still getting root growth and root development. So it's a good time to feed the lawn and not have that surge growth, and have all of that effort and energy being directed down into the roots and the crowns and the underground structures of the plant. But again, if we get warm enough period of weather, things could switch internally in the plant. The plant could start having apical dominance again, where it's promoting that lush green growth, and that's that's what we don't want to have going into the winter months if we are trying to prevent snow mold. So again, don't over fertilize. Especially true on tall fescue. Tall fescue is it's a lower maintenance grass. It doesn't need as much nitrogen fertility as blue and rye. So you may want to consider, dare I say this, you may want to consider not fertilizing, not doing a winterizer application on tall fescue at all. Or one thing that I've done is use an organic fertilizer, something that's got relatively low amount of readily available nitrogen, just so you're not really going to be promoting a whole lot there. So you can still fertilize tall fescue, but maybe we want to go with a really low nitrogen. Maybe we want to go with a really high slow release, or maybe even an organic product, just so that we're not going to over promote lush green growth on that tall fescue. Remember, tall fescue is primarily affected by this disease because it has such a wide blade, compared to other grasses. So it is particularly susceptible to snow mold. And we don't want to do things that kind of prevent it from hardening off, or maybe going dormant to some degree over the winter time. If we keep it very, very green and lush going into winter, it's probably going to get zapped with this. And then, frankly, there's probably not a whole lot you can do when it comes to tall fescue to prevent it. But I will tell you that tall fescue does a very, very fine job of growing out of this, no problem. Um, and one thing that we can do when we do those winterizer applications is use fertilizers late in the season that provide potassium and sulfur. So products that contain ammonium sulfate or maybe a potassium sulfate would be perfect. Or ammonium sulfate as a nitrogen source is great because, again, it has that sulfur in there. But ammonium sulfate doesn't really contribute to surge growth like urea does. And again, like I mentioned a moment ago, organics and hybrid organics are also good. So an organic hybrid fertilizer that's maybe got potassium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, if you could find such an animal. One product that I sell it's a 14-14-10 product. I actually sell it as a landscape fertilizer for the beds and stuff, and ornamental plants. But you can actually use that on lawns. I use it as a rescue application a lot. It works really, really well. Has potassium sulfate in it, has ammonium sulfate in it. So, it's got all those good things. So that one actually might not be a bad one to consider, or something along those lines. Again, there really aren't any good fungicides to prevent snow mold. The only one really that's effective is PCMB, pentachloronitrobenzene. This one, I guess the old trade name would be Revere. If you've ever heard that name before, many of you probably haven't. But it's still available, PCMB. This one here is Turfside, but PCMB, it is limited to golf course use, and it does need multiple applications to get the turf through the winter. So one application in like early December is not going to be enough to get it through. If we get a January thaw, you're going to want to get out there again midwinter and reapply it if you can. So it's really best to manage this thing with cultural and physical maintenance practices. So now let's get into the obscure and the oddities in the lawn care world. This one is fairy ring. I'm sure all of you have seen fairy ring at some point. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it. There are literally hundreds of fungi that cause fairy ring. It's not just one or a few. There's literally hundreds of them. Most of them are relatively benign, but a few of them can cause problems in turf. Sometimes there are mushroom halos present in a lawn, like in this picture here. But sometimes they just darken the turf, like you just might see this ring or halo of darker turf in an area. And a lot of times they're the result of decomposition of an old tree that was removed from a lawn, sometimes years and years ago, and then you're left with that decaying organic matter underground. So a lot of times if I see this, especially with the mushrooms in a lawn like this, that's a lot of times a pretty good indicator that there used to be a tree in the middle of that ring at one point in time that was removed. But they can actually also result from either soils that are very organically rich or really thatchy lawns. So if you have a lot of thatch, again, when we talk about thatch management, if we have excessive thatch in a lawn, we can get fairy ring in these. So the main issue when we talk about fairy ring when it comes to turf management is something called localized dry spots, or LDS. And what happens is a lot of these fungal agents will actually coat the soil particles with a hydrophobic compound, organic compounds that repel water, and they prevent water, and if you're doing a fungicide application, actually prevent the fungicide, because it has to be carried in with water, from entering the soil. So it ends up being a beneficial mechanism to help these fungi survive. And so, along those lines, fungicides typically are not effective management tools. There are a couple that have. There's one that's been around for a long time. There's another one that's come out relatively recently that we're starting to see some efficacy on fairy rings, especially the more antagonistic ones. But generally speaking, you're better off to use things like soil penetrants, wetting agents that are specifically soil penetrants that will help break through that soil column and help that water infiltrate in. ProStar is one fungicide that, again, this is one that's been around for a long time. It is effective with some types of fairy ring. So it's not going to necessarily get rid of any or all of them, but some, especially the ones that tend to be more deadly to turf, this one can be effective. Again, when it comes to management practices, we're typically trying to manage the thatch. Aeration is another tool, because again, if you're puncturing holes through that hydrophobic zone, you're going to create opportunities for water to infiltrate and to prevent that soil from drying out. So aeration can be a really, really effective management tool, especially in sand-based situations like higher end athletic fields and golf course, like greens and tees. This could be a very, very effective management tool. There are three types of fairy rings. Type 1 will cause the halos and will cause a localized dry spot and dead turf. This one actually does attack and kill the turf. Type 2 will have a halo and mushrooms, and it can cause a localized dry spot, but it does not kill the turf. And then type 3 doesn't have a halo, but it does produce mushrooms, and that's about all it does. So this is the one where you get the magic mushroom show in the middle of a lawn where that old oak tree used to stand 20 or 30 years ago. That would be your type 3 fairy ring. Sorry, I'm starting to blank out there. So the other one that I'm going to hit on as far as oddities, general oddities in lawn care, would be just your general lawn mushrooms. Especially if you're in the lawn care, like residential lawn care biz, you're going to get a lot of homeowners and clients probably asking you what can be done about these, or if they need to worry about them. But they're not a fungal pathogen. They do not cause any harm to the turf. And fairy ring to some degree can fit into this category, especially if it's a type 2 or type 3 fairy ring. But beyond that, these are generally beneficial fungi that are naturally present in our soils. And they exist in far greater number in the soil than pathogenic fungi. So these guys, we actually want them there because they actually keep the pathogenic fungi in check. Remember that these plant pathogenic fungi, in most circumstances, when they're turned off, are generally weak. They're not very, very strong and aggressive fungal agents, and it's only when certain things align and you can flip a switch in them that they actually turn into attack mode and go after a plant. Otherwise, they're really relatively weak and benign, and they're a lot of times kept in check by these other beneficial fungi. So, So these things are always in the soil. They're there. You just don't notice them unless you get the perfect recipe, the perfect combination of wet conditions and decaying organic matter. A lot of times this is going to be present, in any circumstance. Anytime you've got an adequate amount of organic matter in the soil, you're going to get mushrooms. It's just a fact of life. So it's not a sign of a problem. It's actually the opposite. It's a sign that you have some very, very good things going on in that lawn, because you have enough organic matter in that soil to promote these. So that's really a good thing. My lawn's only it's actually 4 years old. It'll be 4 years old this year. And I can tell you that I get fungi all over my yard. Now, I put a fair amount of organic matter in. I put tall fescue in, which really helps to build up that biomass in the soil. Other than that, I mean, it was pulverized rock. I literally planted in the pulverized rock. So I'm actually, it's a little annoying when you see these things all over. My kids find them entertaining. They love going out there and killing the mushrooms, and kicking them and breaking them off and whatever. Just don't eat them. That's what I tell them. But beyond that, they find them fun. But it actually is a really, really good sign that you've got some really good things going on in that lawn situation. And if we ever have periods in the summertime where you have a lot of humidity, a lot of rainfall, and you have a decent amount of organic matter or thatch in that lawn, it's going to promote these. Um, you know, but never fear, because if you do have a really thatchy lawn, these are going to help break that thatch down. So treating with fungicides is pointless, and so I don't recommend doing that. And it's just a waste of time and money. Sometimes you might get a client asking, if you can go out and do a fungicide to get rid of them. They want you to do something, and it's just useless. What I would do is focus on cultural practices, things like bagging the clippings for a while on that lawn to maybe if it is a really thatchy lawn, try and remove the clippings for a little while to allow that thatch to kind of break down in that lawn. Another thing would be, removing that thatch either through dethatching or aeration, and also increasing water infiltration and alleviating compaction at the same time, can help reduce this. And at the end of the day, you can just mow them off. I mean, all those mushrooms is it's like the tip of the iceberg. They're the reproductive fruiting structure of what is otherwise a huge, huge, massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet of a fungal colony underground, and all you're seeing is just a very, very small piece of what is a very, very huge organism living in that soil. And so, it pretty much is going to do these, or each species is only going to reproduce those mushrooms at certain times. So if you go out there and mow that lawn and mow them off, you're pretty much going to remove them. So now we're going to get into talking a little bit more about the fungicides that we use on turf. This is just a picture of a disease cycle calendar, kind of illustrating, how we have different windows throughout the year when these diseases are present. I will tell you, being in this business on the supply side, there are more fungicides available for use on turf than any other pesticide. It's kind of aggravating for me, as a turf expert, so to speak, that when I'm going to clients, it's like I could tell you a million different fungicides to use, but there just aren't a lot of when you compare it to herbicides or even insecticides for that matter, we just don't have a lot of options out there. The thing to keep in mind, though, is most of these fungicides that are available for turf use are going to be limited to either higher end athletic turf or golf. Most of them are not going to be cost effective for use on residential and commercial turf. And, and in addition to that, if you think this is something, if you want to go in and start a lawn care business, and you want to do applications and stuff, just keep in mind This isn't something that you're necessarily going to want to really push heavily, especially if you're just starting out, because lawn care companies typically only treat about 10, or maybe if they're really, really successful at selling it and they've been around a long time, they might have as much as 20% of their customer base that'll bite off. But typically, general rule of thumb, I only see about 10% of the total square footage in a lawn care company being treated either preventatively or curatively. Most clients, especially in a commercial setting, they just don't care, or if they do care and bring it to your attention, if you're going to go through all the hoops of giving them a price, you might as well aim high and throw something off the cuff, because 9 times out of 10 they're going to say forget about it. Okay, and most fungicides are only going to stop the infection from continuing. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So it's not like, okay, it's not like the doctor, okay, I got this problem, I'm gonna go get a pill and it's going to clear it up and it's going to go away. No, that's not what happens with these fungicide compounds. What they do is they're going to stop that infection from continuing to spread and affect the turf, but they're not going to cure the turf or help that turf recover that's already infected and dying. So that's kind of a misnomer when you have a client. Let's just say you're a lawn care guy and you go in, you have a homeowner and you put a fungicide down. It's going to get worse before it gets better, and you're going to put this fungicide down. They're going to call you, be like, it's not working. My lawn's gotten worse since you put that down. What did you do? You don't know what you're doing. It's like, no, that's not how that product works. It stops it from spreading, but it's not going to stop the dying turf from dying. Okay, and it's not going to do anything to promote recovery. It's this is something where when we're in this situation, we're going to have to do other things to help promote that lawn to recover, from a disease. So out of all pesticides, fungicides unfortunately have the greatest risk of resistance developing, which is why the use is so limited on them. And that's why we really, when we talk about like chemical rotations and things, most things, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that in order for resistance to develop, you need to have more than one reproductive cycle in a season. So when we see insect resistance or weed resistance, it's because we have more than one reproductive cycle where if it is able to survive, it can pass that trait on to its offspring, and there you go, you've developed resistance. So fungicides are particularly susceptible to resistance because, with disease, especially in turf, we have this window of activity where through that active window or that active period of the season where that disease can be present and actively infecting the turf, it's going to be continually infecting and producing reproductive structures and producing spores over and over and over and over and over again through that cycle. So it makes it very, very likely that resistance is going to develop. So that's why a lot of these new fungicides, when they first come out, are restricted exclusively to golf or to high-end athletic turf, because we need to protect these chemistries. It costs a lot of money to develop them, to bring them to market. And so, we need to protect these chemistries because they stand the greatest risk of resistance developing. And that's part of the reason when we talk about there's more fungicides available on the market than anything else. That's why we have to have more fungicides, because there's more resistance against fungicides than any other chemistry that we use in lawn care or in the landscape in general. We do our best to try and manage and protect these chemistries. One of the ways that we do this is by rotating chemistries or using combinations of fungicides from different frac groups. And that's something where if any of you want more of this information, I can give it to you. There's fungicide resistance, charts. There's herbicide resistance category charts. There's insecticide resistance. As you can imagine, there's HRAC and IRAC and FRAC. Each category of pesticides got charts, associated with it, recommendations that we can make to prevent resistance from happening. And that's the whole point of all of this. It's the only reason I bring it up, is so that that there's strategies in place that you want to consider to help prevent resistance. So some of the more common options that I use in lawn care, especially call it the residential commercial segment. One is pillar granular. So this is a combination of Trinity, which is a DMI fungicide, and Insignia, which is a strobilurin fungicide. So when we're talking about the frac groups, so here we are, two different frac groups. And the cost on this product is $8 per 1,000 square feet. The thing that I love about this product is this is a unique product in that this is one of the few fungicides that actually will help promote growth and recovery and overall plant health. And when you put it down on a lawn, even if you use it as a preventative, you actually do get improved or enhanced turf color and health and vigor out of this product. That's very unusual for most fungicides. Most of them aren't going to do this. This is one of the few that actually does. So the DMIs in general do have some, like I told you before, they have some PGR, plant growth regulator effect on turf. But some of these, it's more enhanced than others, and some of them work better than others. And Pillar is an example of that. It also covers a very, very broad spectrum of diseases. So if you're concerned, it works really well as a preventative, but it also works well if you have a problem, you're not sure what you're dealing with, even if it's Pythium, this is going to cover the gamut. Insignia, this one is a strobilurin. Again, this is one of the ingredients in Pillar, but Insignia is a good option as a standalone product. Typically, you're looking at about that's another thing. So cost per 1,000 on this is typically going to be about $8 per 1,000. Insignia, standalone product, depending on the rate that you use, because there are rate ranges on these products. Pillar doesn't. It's pretty much a one and done. A 30-pound bag does 10,000 square feet, so you don't have to deviate from that. Insignia, most of these fungicides do have a low rate and a high rate depending on what animal you're dealing with and if it's a preventative versus a curative rate. So just that's why most of these you're going to have a price range, is for that reason. But Insignia, typically $6 to $10 per 1,000 square feet. Compass, which is another strobilurin, been around a little bit longer. Kind of similar price point, $5 to $8 per $1,000 or per 1,000 square feet. Zempler, this is a relatively new chemistry. This one's only been out for a few years. This one is a dicarboxamide, so a different frac group. It's not a strobilurin, it's not a DMI, it's a dicarboxamide. Again, whole different chemistry. This one's not bad for lawn care. Typically in a $4 to $5 per 1,000 square feet, and it is a very new chemistry. So just something to keep in mind. Came out when BASF brought this product out. They actually released it for both golf and other non-golf turf sites like residential lawns and commercial turf. So doesn't normally happen when we bring these new chemistries out. Typically, they're reserved exclusively for golf and high-end athletic turf. So Lexicon, along the same lines as Zempler, at the same time they came out with Lexicon. So this one is Trinity and Zempler combined. So it would be both of those active ingredients combined in one product. This one's a little bit more money, $8,000 to $12,000 per 1,000 square feet. But I mean, this will keep things squeaky clean. If you use this regularly on a golf course, it's really going to eliminate the need to really use much anything else. I've seen some programs where it's expensive. It's one of the more expensive products that you can use even in golf, but it does a really, really good job, and it's got a very, very long residual. This one is another one that we see in residential and commercial turf. I've been using it or falling on it a little bit more than I used to, mainly because I am seeing resistance with some of the DMIs like Banner Max, which is propiconazole. So I have switched some guys over to thiophanate methyl. It's cheap. So from a lawn care standpoint, it's cheap. It's pretty effective. You know, very relatively short lived. I mean, you're not going to get much more than a couple of weeks of activity out of this. And it's limited as far as its residential rate, so you can't go much higher too. And if you happen to get into ornamental care where you're doing like tree and shrub and other stuff, the other product with or the other benefit of this product is it does have crossover labeling where you can use it both in turf and in an ornamental setting. So that's kind of nice if you're looking for less products on the shelf. This one's not a bad option. When we talk about DMIs, one that we don't always necessarily think about is myclobutanil. Trade name on this one would be Eagle. This one's not terribly priced. It's kind of middle of the pack. Not as cheap, again, as the thiophanate methyl or Cleary's 3336. This one's a little bit more. It's about $2 to $4 per 1,000 square feet. Again, it's a DMI. Pretty effective on a lot of stuff. Not going to help you out with like Pythium or anything like that, but a lot of your other turf diseases, and again, has crossover labeling in ornamental. Heritage azoxystrobin. This is I don't know why I put DMI on there. That's a typo. I'm sorry about that. This one is a strobularin, not a DMI. So if we're again looking to rotate things, this is going to be a similar price point to the myclobutanil in that $2 to $4 per 1,000 square feet. The one caveat with this product is it's really weak on dollar spots. So usually in a turf setting, we're using it in combination with something else because, like you're going to use it in combination with a DMI because it's just not great on it. Propiconazole, this is the most commonly used DMI out there. It's got a broad price range because, again, 30 cents to $2 per 1,000 square feet because there's a couple of different formulations. So at the low end rate on the more concentrated product, you might be only 30 cents per 1,000 square feet. Or if you're going at a high rate, a curative rate with the less concentrated product, you're going to be closer to 2. But it's pretty cheap for most stuff out there. It is very cheap. So this one's probably the most commonly one used, especially in your for-profit residential commercial lawn fertilizing companies. It's a commodity product anymore. The challenge with this one is resistance is developing. And remember, we talked about like with leaf spot how certain products like DMIs can actually enhance or promote disease because they kind of stunt the plant and prevent it from actually growing and recovering. In some cases, can actually enhance that disease on it. So another product in lawn care is Zoxy PG. This is a granular product. This is a combination of azoxystrobin and propiconazole. So again, one of the ways that we can address resistance in the field is by doing a combination of two different actives. You stand less of a chance of disease resistance developing. And if you remember, azoxystrobin wasn't particularly strong on dollar spot, but propiconazole is. So, a combination of these two can really help you out, kind of broaden the spectrum. I don't like this one as much as Pillar, but it is a granular product. So if you're looking for another standby product that's a little bit cheaper, maybe something to throw in the back of the vans or the trucks just to have on hand, to go put out brush fires, so to speak, this one's a good product to consider. Again, I don't like it as much as Pillar just because you don't get those additional benefits out of it that you do the Pillar. It doesn't have as broad a spectrum, but still not a bad product. It will help you with things like Pythium, but a little bit cheaper price point at $6.50 per 1,000 square feet. That's pretty much a set rate, just like Pillar, one rate, one price. So kind of easy on that front too. Um, when we talk about these fungicides in general, I mean, the rate ranges are pretty broad depending on the disease and whether or not it's preventative or curative treatment. So just keep that in mind. I mean, it's really hard to come up with a per thousand or per acre charge because it's going to be very unique and very specific to however you're using that product and for what. Um, and again, most fungicides, with the exception of a few, most fungicides are not going to promote growth and recovery from a disease. So not only you're going to have a client budget for the cost of the fungicide, but you're also going to want to make recommendations and have them budget for additional inputs, to help promote growth and recovery. And keep in mind that even if you stop that disease, if it's something like, say, a summer patch, for example, you're not necessarily going to recover that turf. So you're probably going to want to help the lawn go out, do some reseeding. If you're doing aerations, you may want to do some oversee. You may want to include some more improved varieties. If it's something like gray leaf spot, you're going to want to probably go in there and oversee with some gray leaf spot resistant rye. Things like that where you're going to want to maybe budget for some additional inputs in that situation. Now we're going to get into kind of paralleling with disease, but not disease, in the sense that a disease is actually going to have some sort of causal agent that is a biological causal agent. We have other causal agents. So similar to a disease, we have these abiotic issues. Again, it's not a disease because it's not being caused by a biological agent. These are abiotic issues in lawn care. So there are many times that we see in a lawn care situation or a turf situation in general where abiotic issues masquerade as diseases or insect issues, or we also see the reverse, vice versa, which is that you might see insect or disease issues masquerading as an abiotic issue. More often, the disease itself is a symptom of a bigger abiotic issue. So the mere presence of a pathogen doesn't equal cause. So, again, it gets back to, the adage, do we treat the symptom or are we trying to cure the disease? And keep in mind that just because you find a few lesions for dollar spot or something on a lawn, that doesn't mean that you have a problem and you need to rush out there like Ghostbusters and spray something on that lawn. It is perfectly normal in a healthy lawn to find some disease activity in that lawn all the time. You can almost certainly at any time of the year go out and find a fungal agent causing some damage on turf. It tends to be very minuscule and very localized. But that's very common in a healthy lawn situation to see that. It's not a sign of there being a bigger problem. But, one of the things that can happen when we see that extensive disease, like, when we're talking about the red thread dollar spot complexes and things like that, is there could be some sort of nutrient deficiency or a structural issue with the soil. In the case of red thread and dollar spot or many of the diseases, you might have some sort of nitrogen or phosphorus deficiency. Maybe we have a potassium deficiency that's causing, snow mold to be worse in some areas than others. We might be talking about a nitrogen deficiency in a lot of diseases where we just don't have adequate nitrogen for that turf to grow out. Another thing that we'll see, that's not disease related, that's an abiotic issue is, you might have animals coming back and foraging in a lawn. And this is another one. Again, you got skunks or other critters out there, birds digging around, tearing up the grass. But that doesn't mean that there's a problem there. And you got to rush out again like Ghostbusters and throw an insecticide or Dialox the lawn or whatever. It could be that those animals just maybe thought they smelled something down there, or maybe that's an area where at some time in the past they scored a quick meal and they just go back there because they remember it, and they just go back there looking again. But little did they know that 2 or 3 years ago you started putting a preventative insecticide down, and there's no more grubs or other issues in there. But nonetheless, they're going to still get in there and maybe forage around looking for something. Maybe it's just the wrong type of grass in that location. Sometimes it's just maybe grass shouldn't be there at all. Okay, but sometimes it could just be the wrong type of grass in that situation. Sometimes we run into situations where we get chemical or fertilizer burn from applications we've done. Maybe the weather conditions weren't great. It was either too hot, too dry when we were out, and we ended up with a problem there. Sometimes it's something like this where you have Roundup or another non-selective herbicide that caused injury to the turf. I see this a lot of time with homeowners, especially the weekend warriors who go to Home Depot or Lowe's and pick up a bottle of that Spectracide. They don't read that label carefully where it says that it's a grass and weed killer. And they go out and they think, well, I'm just, I pay a lawn care company to come in and treat my lawn, but I'm just, I'm a perfectionist and this isn't good enough. So I'm going to go out and, any little thing that I see that I don't like in that lawn, I'm going to go out there. In addition to the lawn care company I'm already paying to come in, I'm going to go out there and spray these spots. The next thing you know, they're calling you, blowing up your phone like, I got this problem. Then they always look at you. I don't know what it is about these guys, but they always look at you with this sheepish look on their eyes, like, what happened and what did you do to my lawn? And this is no different. I mean, somebody might say, what did you do to my lawn? What did I do to my lawn? What did you do to your lawn, Mr. Jones? Like, I didn't do this, you know? But I guarantee you, if you're in the biz, and especially if you're working with residential clients, you're going to come across this at some point, and they never admit it. They're always embarrassed and ashamed that they caused this damage, and they never want to admit it, and they want to pin it on you. And then in addition to that, they want you to fix it for free. That's the ultimate go-getter there, right? Not only are they blaming you, or and they always do this good cop, bad cop thing too, where it's like initially they kind of play it off dumb, and then they wait for you to give them your response or whatever, and then they come out and it's like good cop, bad cop. Oh, and I'm going to come after you now. And so, but again, this is an abiotic issue, right? This wasn't caused by any kind of disease or insect issue. It was just, stupidity. And last time I checked, stupidity is an abiotic issue. So, biological mechanism, but, abiotic issue nonetheless. So mechanical injury to turf, either from traffic, stuff driving over it, or foot traffic, equipment damage, especially if it's real hot or real cold. Sometimes you can get damage to the turf. Sometimes, if you're out and you do a chemical application, you get that, herbicide or whatever builds up on that wheel, because it's wet and you're spraying and you're driving over hot, dry grass, and then you end up getting a concentrated dose of that herbicide on your wheels, and you can actually get wheel marks and stuff through a lawn. Or maybe, again, getting back to that fertilizer pesticide burn where, maybe when you were turning or something, you still had the spray on, it got a little concentrate, a little hot in an area when you were making a turn, or maybe you slowed down as you were approaching something or trying to go around something, and just slow down enough to where that dose was just a little too potent and you did some damage. Another one that we'll see too is, alcohol damage. I ran into this downtown years ago. I called it LeBron Fest when the Cavs won the championship, and they had million plus people downtown in Cleveland. Obviously, as you would imagine, a lot of them were drinking and having a good time, and I found all sorts of interesting things all over that grass the morning after. You want to talk about a bad morning after, man. That grass looked horrible down there in Memorial Plaza, and they called me in because 3 weeks after that was the Republican National Convention, and they needed to get that grass growing again and turned around. And I performed some miracles down there to help get that thing turned around. But nonetheless, there was a lot of alcohol damage all over that turf. I mean, you could literally smell the beer and and malt liquor all over the place down there. It was really bad. But another one that we don't often think about too is bug spray. Is another example where you get that mist and you're spraying your ankles down around your shoes. This is out on a golf course, obviously. Somebody felt like, oh, I'm going to stop and just hit myself real quick with bug spray out on the grass, and well, there you go. They left a nice footprint there, from the overspray. So, things like that. Another one that I run into a lot, and you'll see this a lot out in a turf setting, is what I call hidden treasures. So these are unusual objects or debris that's usually just below the surface. Sometimes it can be manhole covers and other things. Just below the surface, or maybe if it was a construction site where they kind of left a bunch of rubble and debris and just kind of coated the dirt over top of it and didn't really feel like cleaning it up, or maybe there's old railroad beds or gravel driveways or something like that grew over time. So you can run into those kind of situations too, where you have hidden treasures under the surface, septic tank lids, things like that. And then obviously, one of the most common ones that we run into in the turf setting would be drought stress. This is, again, an abiotic issue. It's just weather. Drought stress, grass is going dormant, going into decline because of heat and drought conditions. So the opposite of drought stress would be frost or freeze damage. I actually got some calls about this relatively recently this year. This will happen at times of the year when, either in the spring where we have a warm up and that grass starts growing in spots, and then we get like a real cold night or a frosty night where it actually causes damage to that lush green new grass. And then all the areas in between where it didn't really grow as much, that's still green, but the areas that grew a lot, that's where you see all the brown and the death in. Because that frost got a hold in those areas and just wiped it out. Now, this grass will recover. It'll come out of this just fine. But, again, I saw this again, like I said, this spring in a lot of areas. Somebody's like, oh my God, what happened? This is all over the place. I'm like, yeah, that's freeze damage. So you can also get this too in the fall and the winter, especially if you get one of those glazy type snows where you get these little ripples and bands across the lawn. Again, in the fall, let's just say you put that winterizer down, you put a little too much down, the grass was a little too green, and the temperature and the weather changed a little too fast in the late fall, early winter, and next thing you know, boom, I get some snow, and I start getting some snow drifts and things like that, or maybe got some freezing conditions one night where we had a hard freeze. Same thing, we can see this happen. So that concludes this discussion. And again, as always, I'm available to you guys as a resource. Any questions, any concerns you guys have, please feel free to reach out to me, call me, text me, email me. That concludes Module 13. So I will bid adieu, and we'll see you guys later.